In the weathered housing projects of South Bronx, New York, where concrete walls absorbed the city's constant hum, lived a 12-year-old boy named Elijah Carter. Every morning, Elijah woke at 5:30 a.m., not to play video games or practice basketball like many of his classmates, but to help his father clean the small barbershop where they worked part-time. His father, Terrence, was a broad-shouldered man with gentle eyes who always said, "Your circumstances don't define your character." Elijah didn't have many friends. His second-hand clothes, always clean but visibly worn, and his scuffed shoes made him an easy target for teasing at Riverside Middle School. He usually sat in the corner of the classroom, quiet and reserved, but his dark eyes always held something profound, as if they carried melodies he only dared to hum when no one was listening. Before we continue following Elijah's extraordinary journey, if you believe that a person's true worth isn't defined by appearance or background, but by unwavering passion and perseverance, then please hit like and subscribe to the channel. Together, let's share inspiring stories like this with more people. And now, let's return to the story where unexpected turns await. One Wednesday morning, the principal's voice crackled through the PA system. "Attention, students, our annual talent showcase is coming up. If you'd like to participate, please sign up outside the music room by Friday." The classroom buzzed with excitement. Some kids boasted about their dance routines, while others planned to showcase their rap skills or basketball tricks. Elijah remained silent. But that night, after sweeping hair at his father's barbershop and listening to an old vinyl record his father treasured a collection of classical piano pieces by black composers, he picked up a pencil and wrote his name on a small slip of paper. He whispered, "I'll play that piece, Dad, the one by Scott Joplin you always loved, Maple Leaf Rag." The next day, he stood motionless in front of the bulletin board outside the music room. His hands trembled. The list was already long with popular students' names. With a deep breath, he wrote on the very last line, "Elijah Carter, piano." Less than 15 minutes later, laughter echoed down the hallway. "Elijah signed up to play piano. Where's he even going to find one? In the dumpster?" Elijah heard every word, but he didn't flinch. He just lowered his head and walked away, clutching the worn sheet music he'd carefully copied by hand from his father's old book. That evening, his father found him practicing silently on a paper keyboard he'd drawn on cardboard. Terrence quietly opened the door, said nothing at first, and eventually sat down beside his son. "You know," he said softly, "my grandmother was a concert pianist before segregation closed those doors. She taught me to play, but then life happened. Your mother got sick, and I had to work 3 jobs. I never regretted it, but if I could see you walk onto that stage, that would be the greatest gift I could receive." Elijah looked up at his father, eyes glistening. "Will you come?" Terrence nodded. "Even if I have to miss a day's work." On rehearsal day, Elijah was the last contestant. The music teacher asked curtly, "Do you need accompaniment?" "No, ma'am. Just the piano, please." A sigh and several eye rolls followed, but Elijah stood tall. The school's old upright piano sat in the corner, its ivory keys yellowed with age. Elijah approached it with reverence, sat down, closed his eyes, and began to play. It wasn't just notes, it was history flowing through his fingers. The ragtime melody, once played in segregated clubs by black musicians who transformed American music, now danced under the hands of a boy who'd never had a formal lesson. Within seconds, the room fell still. The music teacher looked up from her clipboard. Another teacher, walking past the door, stopped mid-stride. Elijah's playing wasn't technically perfect, but it carried something rare, authenticity. His body swayed with the syncopated rhythm, his face transformed by pure joy. When he finished, no one spoke, not because they didn't appreciate it, but because they'd forgotten what they were supposed to do after witnessing something so unexpected and genuine. On the bus ride home, Elijah asked his father, "Dad, if people laugh, should I stop?" Terrence smiled and gently squeezed his son's shoulder. "No, son, you keep playing because the world needs to hear the music that comes from struggle." The morning of the showcase, Riverside Middle School's auditorium was packed. Colorful banners hung from the walls, and a temporary stage was adorned with the school logo, Riverside Middle, where excellence flows. Elijah arrived early. Wearing his father's old dress shirt, carefully ironed and slightly too big, his hair was neatly trimmed. His father had given him a special cut the night before. In his hands, he clutched the sheet music, now protected in a plastic sleeve. Terence stood beside him, holding his son's shoulder. Despite working the night shift as a security guard, he had made every effort to be there. His face showed fatigue, but his eyes radiated pride. The students performed one by one. A group of girls performed a choreographed dance to a popular song. Two boys showcased an impressive beatboxing routine. A girl in designer clothes sang a pop hit through a wireless microphone. Each act was met with enthusiastic cheers from friends in the audience. Elijah sat alone in the waiting area. No one spoke to him. A few sideways glances came his way, followed by whispers. "Just wait. The charity case is coming up. Probably never even touched a real piano before." Elijah Carter, the announcer called, performing a piano solo. A few scattered claps. Some students pulled out their phones, ready to record what they expected would be a disaster. Elijah walked onto the stage. From up there, the lights blinded him to the audience. But he knew his father was there, sitting in the second row near the aisle, and that knowledge gave him strength. He sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and began to play. The opening notes of Maple Leaf Rag filled the auditorium, tentative at first, then growing in confidence. His fingers, calloused from sweeping floors and helping his father, now danced across the keys with unexpected grace. At first, there were whispers and restless movements, but gradually the entire auditorium fell silent. A strange hush spread across the room, not the silence of boredom, but of collective astonishment. The music teacher, who had been checking her phone, suddenly looked up. The principal, who had been speaking to a parent, turned toward the stage with widened eyes. Every note Elijah played seemed to carry the weight of history, of struggle, of quiet nights practicing on a paper keyboard while dreaming of real ivory keys. No fancy technique, no showmanship. Just a boy playing with his whole heart. When the final chord resonated, the room remained silent. 3 seconds, then 4. Then applause erupted, not polite or obligatory, but thunderous and genuine. One person stood, then another. Soon, the entire auditorium was on its feet. Elijah sat still, hands resting on the keys, eyes closed, a single tear sliding down his cheek. The spotlight illuminated his face. He was no longer the poor boy from the projects, but an artist living his truth. In the audience, Terence stood tall, one hand over his heart, tears streaming freely down his face. After the performance, as Elijah stepped down from the stage, a woman in a tailored suit approached him. "You must be Elijah, right?" "I'm Dr. Vanessa Powell, Director of Community Outreach for the Harlem School of Music. I was here because my nephew performed earlier, but it was you who captured my attention. Would you be interested in auditioning for our scholarship program?" Elijah didn't know how to respond. He turned to his father. Terence nodded, unable to speak through his emotion. "Go on, son. This is the music the world has been waiting to hear." On Saturday morning, Elijah Carter stepped into a professional music studio for the first time. The walls were lined with acoustic panels, and soft lighting cast a warm glow that felt both foreign and magical. Outside, the cacophony of New York City continued unabated, but inside this room, time seemed suspended. Dr. Powell had arranged for a car to pick up Elijah and his father from their apartment. She was a distinguished woman in her 50s with silver-streaked dreadlocks and keen, observant eyes. "Think of today as an exploration," she said gently. "No pressure. Just play the way you did that day." Elijah nodded, clutching his sheet music like a talisman. He wore his school uniform, the cleanest clothes he owned. No pretense, no facade, just himself, honest and unadorned. Raymond, the studio technician, adjusted the microphones around the grand piano. He had a salt-and-pepper beard and the quiet demeanor of someone who had heard thousands of musicians but was rarely surprised. When Elijah walked in, Raymond raised an eyebrow. "This is our prospect?" he asked Dr. Powell through the intercom. "Yes, trust me, Raymond. Just let him play." Elijah approached the Steinway grand piano, larger and more magnificent than anything he'd ever touched. Dr. Powell walked into the recording room and gently placed a hand on his shoulder. You can play the Scott Joplin piece again or anything you'd like. Elijah looked through the glass at his father, who gave him an encouraging nod, then turned to Dr. Powell. I'll play my father's song. His fingers touched the keys, and the room filled with the joyful, complex rhythms of ragtime. Raymond sat motionless. Dr. Powell closed her eyes, and Elijah disappeared into the music, his small frame swaying with each syncopated beat. When the piece ended, no one spoke for several seconds. Then Raymond leaned toward the microphone. You've never had formal training, have you? No, sir. Yet you understand phrasing, dynamics, and emotional expression without being taught. Kid, your technique needs work, but your musicality is something we can't teach. Dr. Powell returned to the recording room and gently held Elijah's hand. Do you know that Scott Joplin was denied recognition during his lifetime because of the color of his skin? Yet his music endured because it spoke truth. My dad tells me that story, Elijah replied. He says music remembers what history tries to forget. Dr. Powell smiled. Perhaps that's why your playing reaches people the way it does. That afternoon, Dr. Powell submitted Elijah's recording to the admissions committee of the Harlem School of Music's Young Artists program. The scholarship was highly competitive, with only 3 students selected each year from underprivileged communities. You don't have to be perfect, Dr. Powell told Elijah. You just have to be authentic. 3 weeks later, a cream-colored envelope bearing the school's embossed logo arrived at the Carters' apartment. Terrence opened it with trembling hands. Dear Elijah Carter, we are deeply moved by your audition recording. With unanimous approval from our selection committee, we are pleased to offer you a full scholarship to the Harlem School of Music's Young Artist program beginning this September. All tuition, instrument access, and educational materials will be provided. Terrence couldn't continue reading through his tears. Elijah stared at the letter in disbelief before whispering, Dad, I got in. For the first time in his life, Elijah Carter felt like he belonged somewhere. September in Harlem brought golden light that spilled across historic brownstones and cultural landmarks. The Harlem School of Music occupied a renovated theater, its Art Deco facade preserved as a testament to the neighborhood's artistic legacy. For many students in the program, it was simply another extracurricular activity, but for Elijah Carter, it represented an entirely different world, both intimidating and exhilarating. On the first day, Elijah and his father walked up the marble steps together, passing students with expensive instrument cases and designer backpacks. They came from private schools in Manhattan, from musical families with connections to Lincoln Center and Carnegie Hall. Some had been playing since they were toddlers. Others had performed with youth orchestras or competed internationally. And Elijah, from the South Bronx projects, had never read sheet music properly and still practiced on a paper keyboard at home. The orientation took place in a wood-paneled recital hall. Dr. Powell stood at the podium, her voice warm and resonant. Here at Harlem, we honor tradition while embracing innovation. We seek not just technical excellence, but authentic voices that continue our legacy of musical truth-telling. But Elijah soon discovered that those words didn't fully reflect the reality of the program. The first lesson was music theory. The teacher distributed complex worksheets about key signatures, intervals, and chord progressions. Elijah was lost. He had never seen these symbols before. What's your primary repertoire focus? One boy asked during break. I'm not sure what that means, Elijah admitted. What composers do you mainly play? Bach, Chopin, Debussy? Elijah smiled uncertainly. I only know Scott Joplin. That answer drew several surprised looks and a few barely concealed smirks. One student, named Jackson, from an elite private school on the Upper East Side, whispered loudly, Guess they needed to fill their diversity quota this year. The days that followed tested Elijah's resolve. In theory class, he struggled to keep up. In piano technique, his lack of formal training became glaringly obvious. Once, during a group performance, he froze completely, the notes blurring before his eyes as anxiety overwhelmed him. Old memories of being mocked in school came flooding back like a tidal wave. One evening, Elijah sat alone on a bench in the school's courtyard, staring at the twilight sky. Dr. Powell appeared silently, sat beside him, and placed 2 cups of hot chocolate between them. I don't belong here, Elijah whispered. Why do you think that? I'm not like them. I don't understand all the theory. I come from a place they make fun of. Dr. Powell looked at him intently. Elijah, I grew up in the Chicago housing projects. When I first went to Juilliard, people laughed at my accent, at how I didn't know which fork to use at dinner. But one professor told me, technique is teachable, soul is not. You bring something many have forgotten, the reason we make music in the first place. Elijah was quiet, absorbing her words. A week later, the students were assigned to prepare a piece for the fall recital. Jackson chose a complex Liszt etude. Another student selected a Beethoven sonata. And Elijah? He chose a piece his father had recently shown him, Solace by Scott Joplin, a hauntingly beautiful composition that blended ragtime with a melancholy that spoke of both hope and hardship. When Elijah's turn came during rehearsal, many students looked skeptical. No flashy technique, no virtuosic passages, just a boy at the piano playing music that spoke of his heritage and his heart. Jackson, seated in the front row, stopped scrolling through his phone. A faculty member closed her notebook and leaned forward. As Elijah played the final, lingering notes, no one spoke, but everyone felt it. He had reminded the room why music mattered in the first place. The fall recital at the Harlem School of Music took place at the historic Apollo Theater, a venue that had launched countless careers and preserved the cultural legacy of Harlem. That evening, a light rain fell across New York City. Umbrellas dotted the sidewalk outside the theater, and inside, anticipation filled the air. Parents, musicians, community leaders, and even talent scouts from major conservatories were in attendance. Elijah Carter stood backstage, holding his carefully annotated sheet music. He wore a new suit, his first ever, purchased by his father, who had taken on extra shifts to afford it. Around his neck hung a small wooden pendant carved into the shape of a piano key, a gift his father had made by hand. Terrence sat in the middle section, his work-worn hands resting on his knees. He had taken the entire day off, ironed his best shirt, and polished his old dress shoes. When he entered the theater, he paused momentarily upon seeing other parents in expensive attire and jewelry, but he walked proudly to his seat. My son will play on that stage, he thought, and I will be the proudest person in this room. The program began with technically impressive classical pieces, dazzling displays of virtuosity, and confident, well-trained young musicians. Each performance received appreciative applause. Then the announcer said, "Next, from the South Bronx, Elijah Carter performing Solace by Scott Joplin." A subtle murmur passed through the audience. Some shifted in their seats, not expecting much from an unfamiliar name playing a piece outside the classical canon. Elijah walked onto the stage, his steps measured but determined. The stage lights blinded him to the audience. He couldn't see his father, couldn't see Dr. Powell, couldn't make out whether faces were expectant or dismissive. All he could hear was his heartbeat and the memory of his father's words, "Play your truth." He sat at the magnificent grand piano, took a deep breath, and began. The opening notes of Solace rose like a question, delicate and searching. Each phrase Elijah played wasn't just notation on a page. It was the story of late nights practicing on cardboard, of a father's sacrifices, of a legacy of musicians who created beauty despite being denied recognition. The theater gradually fell silent. A critic in the fourth row lowered his program. A talent scout stopped writing notes. Dr. Powell, seated near the back, watched with shining eyes. And then, as Elijah played the final, haunting melody, a passage that Joplin had infused with both sorrow and transcendence, something extraordinary happened. One person stood. It was Terrence. He didn't applaud. He simply stood tall, tears streaming down his face, as if to tell the entire world, "That is my son, and I have heard his music my entire life." 1 second passed, then 2. Then the Apollo Theater erupted. Applause thundered like summer rain. Several people rose to their feet. A renowned pianist in the audience turned to her colleague and whispered, "That boy doesn't just play notes, he tells stories." Jackson, the boy who had once mocked Elijah, sat motionless, then slowly joined the standing ovation. Elijah bowed. This time, there was no trembling, no doubt. He knew he had been seen, not for being flawless, but for being truthful. The next morning, as Elijah and his father had breakfast in their small kitchen, Dr. Powell arrived holding an official envelope. "Congratulations," she said. "The conservatory board met last night. They'd like to offer you early admission to our pre-college division with a full scholarship, including a piano for your home." Terence set down his coffee cup, overcome with emotion. Elijah asked softly, "Will I still have time to help Dad at the barbershop?" Dr. Powell smiled. "If working alongside your father is what gives your music such depth, then I think the school would consider that part of your education." Years later, during a televised interview after his debut at Carnegie Hall, the host asked Elijah Carter, now an acclaimed pianist and composer, "What moment changed your life the most?" Elijah didn't hesitate. "It was the moment my father stood up in that theater. When no one else knew who I was or where I came from, he did, and for me, that was enough to play on." And so the story of Elijah Carter comes to a close. From the projects to the concert hall, from a paper keyboard to Carnegie Hall, from an overlooked boy to an artist who moved hundreds to silence and then to thunderous applause. If this story touched you in any way, share your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe to help us preserve these beautiful moments in a world that moves too quickly. We'll see you again on the next journey.